The number on the screen was 1,420. 1,420 meters, a little under a mile. That was the reading the laser rangefinder gave Captain H.R. McMaster at 18 minutes past 4 in the afternoon on the 26th of February, 1991, in the empty desert west of Kuwait, at the exact moment his gunner told him what was sitting out in front of them. Outside the tank, there was no horizon. A sandstorm had been blowing since morning, thick enough that a man standing on the back deck could barely make out anything 200 meters away. The 9 American tanks of Eagle Troop had just rolled over a rise so gentle that nobody in the formation had registered it as terrain at all. On the far side of it, dug in and waiting, was a brigade of the Iraqi Republican Guard. Staff Sergeant Craig Koch had his eye pressed to the gunner's sight. He counted 8 Iraqi tanks, hull down, turrets already pointed at them. Tanks, he called. Direct front. McMaster gave the order. Fire. Fire, Sabbat. The round that actually left the tube first was the wrong one for the job. A shaped charge round already loaded, meant for bunkers rather than for punching through tank armor. It killed a T-72 anyway. 3 seconds later, the right round followed it. A depleted uranium dart moving at close to a mile a second. And the turret came off a second Iraqi tank in a shower of sparks, while that tank was still traversing to shoot back. 23 minutes later, it was finished. Eagle Troop had cut a 5-kilometer swath through a prepared defensive position, destroyed the armor sitting in it, broken the reserve waiting behind it, and lost nobody. Not one American killed. Not one tank destroyed by enemy fire. That part of the story is true. Every credible account agrees on it, including the computer reconstruction the Pentagon built afterward, accurate to within a single meter. But ask a simpler question. How many did they actually destroy? Ask that, and the legend starts coming apart in your hands. The Army's own definitive study gives one set of numbers. The officer who commanded the troop has published 2 sets, and they do not match each other. And the figure most people repeat, the one that shows up in encyclopedia entries and in video titles, looks like a 30-year-old copying error. So hold on to that rangefinder reading. 1,420 meters. By the end of this, that number is going to mean something very different than it does right now. Before the Gulf War, the M1 Abrams had never fought anyone. It was the most expensive tank the United States had ever built, and it had spent its entire life in training areas in Germany and California, waiting for a Soviet invasion that never came. It had critics, and they were not stupid ones. The gas turbine engine drank fuel at a rate that made planners nervous. The air filters had to be cleaned constantly in dust. The whole thing weighed better than 60 tons, and in an era of increasingly capable anti-tank missiles, there were serious people who argued that the age of the heavy tank was already ending. What its supporters promised was very specific, and it had almost nothing to do with armor. They promised that this tank could see, not see well. See when the other side could not see at all. That was the pitch. And in 1991, in a desert where oil fires blacked out the sky at noon, and sandstorms rolled through for entire days, that pitch was about to be tested against a real enemy for the first time. Here is the ledger it walked away with. According to the Federation of American Scientists, across the entire Gulf War, only 18 Abrams were taken out of service due to battle damage. 9 of those were permanent losses. 9 more were repairable, most of them mine damage. Not a single Abrams crewman was killed in the war. Then read the second half of that record, the part the recruiting posters skip. A Government Accountability Office report on the same losses found that of the 9 Abrams destroyed, 2 were deliberately destroyed by Americans to keep them from being captured, and 7 were destroyed by other Americans. Which means the sentence "no Abrams was confirmed killed by an Iraqi tank," and the sentence "most of the Abrams killed in the Gulf War were killed by their own side" are the same sentence, describing the same 9 vehicles. We will come back to that. First, the machine. Strip away everything else, and the Abrams advantage in 1991 lived inside one box in front of the gunner's face. The gunner's primary sight combined 3 things: a daylight optical channel, a laser rangefinder, and a thermal imaging channel looking through a window made of germanium. That thermal channel is the whole story. A normal optic gathers light. Even a good night vision device gathers light, amplifies whatever moonlight or starlight is available, and hands you a grainy green picture. If there is no light to gather, it gives you nothing. A thermal imager works on a completely different principle. It does not care about light at all. It reads heat. It builds a picture out of the temperature difference between an object and the air around it, which means a tank engine, a hot road wheel, a running exhaust, and a human body all glow against a cold desert background, whether it is noon, midnight, or the middle of a sandstorm. Dust particles block visible light. They do very little to infrared radiation. The practical effect during Desert Storm was that American gunners spent large parts of the war using their night sights in broad daylight, because between the blowing sand and the smoke from burning oil wells, the night sight was simply the better instrument. Detection ranges pushed out toward 3,000 meters. Some crews reported kills at longer ranges than that, against enemy vehicles that gave no sign of having seen anything at all. Now put yourself on the other side of that rise. The Iraqi Army's T-72s were not the tanks the Soviet Army kept for itself. They were export models, the T-72M and M1, and their night fighting equipment was a generation and a half behind. Image intensifiers and older infrared searchlight systems, useful out to perhaps 800 or 1,000 meters on a clear night, and close to useless in a day-long dust storm. Their main gun ammunition was worse. Iraqi units were still firing an armor-piercing round that the Soviet Army itself had dropped from service back in 1973, a projectile credited with something on the order of 245 millimeters of penetration, fired from barrels that maintenance neglect had left worn. Against the frontal armor of an M1A1, that combination was close to meaningless even when it hit. The American gun was the other half of it. 120 millimeters, smoothbore, fully stabilized, which is the unglamorous word that decides tank battles. Stabilization means the gun stays locked on the target while the hull bounces across broken ground at speed. The crew does not have to stop to shoot. A ballistic computer takes the rangefinder's number, folds in crosswind and target motion, and lays the gun. The gunner puts the crosshair on a hot shape and pulls. Out the other end comes a long, dense rod of depleted uranium that defeats armor by sheer kinetic energy. No explosive involved, arriving at roughly a mile a second. So the theory was clean. See first at longer range through anything and hit while moving. The theory said the fight would be one-sided, but a sight is only an instrument. It does not decide who wins. Somebody has to be looking through it, and somebody has to have trained for years to know what to do in the 4 seconds after they see something. Hold that thought, because there is a serious argument among historians that it matters more than the hardware does. The unit that put all of this to the test was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, about 4,500 soldiers under Colonel Don Holder, operating as the covering force screening ahead of the 7th Corps as it swung wide to the west of Kuwait, and came at the Republican Guard from the flank. A cavalry troop in that regiment was roughly 120 soldiers, 9 M1A1 Abrams and 12 M3 Bradleys. Eagle Troop was one of them. The weather on the 26th of February was miserable in a way that shaped everything that followed. Heavy overnight rain gave way to fog, and the fog gave way to a sandstorm that lasted most of the day and kept the regiment's air cavalry on the ground for more than half of it. Neither side could scout. That morning, a corps order swung the axis of advance from northeast to due east, which meant the regiment was pushing into ground nobody had looked at. What was waiting in that ground was not a broken army. This is worth being precise about because the popular memory of the Gulf War is of Iraqi conscripts surrendering to news crews, and that is not what Eagle Troop drove into. Ahead of them, on an old Iraqi military training area, sat a brigade of the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard, reinforced with elements of the 12th Armored Division. It was the seam between 2 formations, which is exactly where armor tends to be thickest. The local commander built a textbook defense. McMaster identifies him as a major named Mohammed and notes something that has stuck with every officer who has heard this story since. He was a graduate of the Infantry Officer Advanced course at Fort Benning, Georgia. He had been taught by the same army that was about to come over his ridge. He put roughly 40 tanks and 16 infantry fighting vehicles on the reverse slope, about 1,000 meters behind a rise so slight it barely registers on a map. He laid 2 kill sacks, seeded minefields, dug hundreds of infantry into trenches, and coiled a reserve of about 18 more T-72s, another 3 kilometers to the east. It was a good plan. It was built on 2 assumptions. The first was that the Americans would be tied to the roads because, in that featureless terrain, navigating off-road was traditionally close to impossible. The second was that he would see them coming. He did not know about the global positioning system. That is the detail that decides the battle before it starts. The Americans were not on the roads because they no longer needed roads. First contact came at about 7 minutes past 4. A Bradley commanded by Staff Sergeant John McReynolds drove directly over an Iraqi observation bunker. 2 soldiers came out and surrendered. Almost simultaneously, another Bradley under Sergeant Maurice Harris took 23mm cannon fire and machine gun fire from a cluster of buildings. His platoon leader's response, relayed in McMaster's own account, was as short as it sounds. Well, kill them. All 9 of Eagle Troop's tanks fired into the position in a near-simultaneous salvo of shaped charge rounds. The buildings stopped shooting. 11 minutes later, McMaster shifted his formation so the tanks led. 9 of them spread in a wedge and crossed the imperceptible rise. Koch called the 8 dug-in tanks. The rangefinder read 1,420. The first 2 kills happened inside about 3 seconds, and then the driver made a decision that says more about American tank crews in 1991 than any specification sheet does. Specialist Christopher Haydenskog realized they had driven into a minefield. The correct doctrinal response is to stop and back out along your own tracks. Haydenskog understood that stopping meant presenting a stationary target, and that turning meant showing the enemy his side armor. So he kept going forward at about 20 kilometers an hour, weaving through the mines while keeping the thickest armor on the tank pointed at the people shooting at him, and then reported it over the intercom in the flattest voice imaginable. "Sir, I think you need to know, we just went through a minefield." Crews who were there described anti-personnel mines going off under the tracks as sounding like popcorn in a microwave. 2 of the dug-in T-72s did manage to shoot at McMaster's tank. Both rounds fell short, 1 on either side. Somewhere in the same few minutes, a round jammed in the breech of Lieutenant Jeff DeStefano's tank, which under any normal circumstance takes that tank out of the fight. The loader kicked the round into the chamber with his boot to clear the jam, and Sergeant Matthew Clark then used that gun to kill a T-72 that was traversing onto them at close range. In the Bradleys, Private First Class Charles Burdabin found the hatch for reloading the anti-tank missile launcher jammed shut. He kicked the release off, climbed out onto the exterior of a moving vehicle while machine gun fire was coming in, hand-loaded 2 missiles, then climbed back and tapped his commander on the shoulder to let him know the launcher was ready. His commander, by all accounts, nearly came out of his seat. Eagle Troop overran the first line and kept going into the reserve coiled to the east. And here the story stops being about equipment. McMaster had been given a limit of advance, a north-south grid line called the 70 Easting, and he was now past it in contact with a beaten enemy in front of him. Stopping meant letting the survivors reorganize. His transmission back has become one of the more quoted lines in modern American armor history, and it is short. "Tell them we can't stop. Tell them I'm sorry." He halted at 440, just short of the 74 Easting on his own judgment. 23 minutes had passed since the first tank contact. In his own words, written not long after, the troop had reduced the enemy position to a spectacular array of burning vehicles. He was given a silver star for it, not a reprimand. If you would rather have the actual combat record, with the numbers argued out in the open, than the highlight reel version, subscribe. Now, back to the desert, because that casualty figure you have heard is not the whole regiment's. That evening at around 6 o'clock, the Iraqis mounted a counterattack, and it was broken up. Eagle Troop took 42 prisoners in the first group and more than 200 over the course of the night, including the brigade commander. To the north, Ghost Troop was fighting a much longer battle, 3 hours of company-strength counterattacks. And it was there, not in Eagle Troop's sector, that the 2nd Squadron lost a man. Sergeant Nels A. Mahler was killed when an Iraqi infantry fighting vehicle everyone had assumed was already knocked out fired a 73mm round into the turret of his Bradley. That matters. 0 losses is an Eagle Troop statistic, not a battle statistic. Across the wider 2nd Armored Cavalry action that day, the regiment is usually credited with about 6 killed, 19 wounded, and 1 Bradley lost to enemy fire. Every time the phrase, "not a single American casualty," gets attached to 73 Easting without that qualifier, Sergeant Mahler disappears from the story. McMaster later walked into the Iraqi commander's observation bunker and found it comfortable. Rugs on the floor, pillows arranged neatly, a good view over the ground where his defense was supposed to work. Major Muhammad, once captured, said he had not known he was under attack until one of his soldiers ran in shouting about tanks. By that point, his entire forward line was already burning. And then the strangest part of the whole affair, which happened after the shooting stopped. Within hours of the ceasefire, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the Institute for Defense Analyses went out and mapped the battlefield, interviewed the crews, pulled the logs, and rebuilt the entire engagement inside a computer simulation to roughly 1 meter of accuracy. It was the first high-fidelity synthetic battlefield of its kind. It was briefed to members of Congress and to foreign diplomats. It is a direct ancestor of the simulation systems every modern military trains on, and McMaster himself helped build it. Which brings us back to the question from the top. If the Pentagon rebuilt this battle in a computer, down to the meter within weeks of it happening, how is it possible that nobody can agree on how many tanks Eagle Troop destroyed? Here is what the sources actually say, and it is worth laying them side by side. McMaster's own after-action account, written in 1991 and corrected against the unit logs, says the troops' tanks and Bradleys destroyed over 30 enemy tanks, approximately 20 personnel carriers and other armored vehicles, and about 30 trucks with an artillery strike, accounting for another 35 trucks and several armored vehicles. McMaster, writing again in 2016, in an essay for The Strategy Bridge, describes approximately 50 T-72s, 25 armored personnel carriers, and 40 trucks destroyed by the troop. Those are the same man describing the same afternoon, 25 years apart, and the tank figure has grown by roughly 2/3. That is not dishonesty. That is what memory does and what retelling does. And it is a useful reminder that a participant account is a primary source, not a measurement. Now, the study. Institute for Defense Analyses paper, P2770, published in 1992 by Christensen and Zirkle, is the authoritative reconstruction, the one built from the simulation work. Its table of Iraqi losses for the Battle of 73 Easting gives 57 tanks, 28 infantry fighting vehicles, 11 armored transports, 45 trucks, and 3 air defense vehicles. But read the header on that table carefully because almost nobody does. Those totals are for all 3 cavalry troops combined: Eagle, Ghost, and Iron. The study never breaks the kills down troop by troop. Do the math on what that means. The engaged Iraqi brigade fielded 58 tanks in total. If Eagle Troop alone destroyed about 50 of them, then 2 other troops fighting their own separate engagements for hours accounted for 7, and the study's own total is impossible. The 2016 figure cannot be squared with the reconstruction, and the number you see most often, the one that circulates as settled fact, that Eagle Troop destroyed 28 tanks and 16 armored personnel carriers, that combination does not appear anywhere in the study. 28 is the study's figure for infantry fighting vehicles destroyed across the whole battle. Somewhere in the chain of copying, a vehicle total from one column appears to have become a tank total in another, and it has been reproduced ever since. Treat it as unreliable. The historian Stephen Bork, in his 1997 work Correcting Gulf War Myths, refuses to play the numbers game at all. His assessment is qualitative. In 23 minutes, one troop destroyed over half of the Iraqi battalion facing it. His larger argument is more interesting than any tally, and it cuts against the easy version of this story. Bork's Tawakalna did not surrender. It fought, caught dismounted, and outranged in weather it could not see through, and it lost. For completeness, McMaster's Silver Star citation credits him personally with 9 T-72s, 14 armored personnel carriers, and around 30 trucks, which almost certainly reflects only what was attributable to his own tank and his immediate direction. So here's the honest answer, and it is a range, not a number. Eagle Troop, on McMaster's contemporaneous log-corrected account, destroyed on the order of 30 tanks plus roughly 20 other armored vehicles and dozens of trucks. The whole 3-troop engagement, on the best reconstruction available, destroyed 57 tanks, 28 fighting vehicles, and 45 trucks. Anyone who gives you a clean Eagle Troop tank count to the unit is giving you an estimate wearing the costume of a fact. If you served in armor, or you have worked the 73 Easting data yourself, put your number in the comments and say what you are working from. The record on this battle is still being argued over by the people who were in it. And yes, before anyone types it, those were export T-72s with downgraded armor and obsolete ammunition, dug into fixed positions, in weather that blinded them. That is not a loophole in the story. That is the story. The question was never whether the Abrams could beat a hypothetical best-case Soviet tank. The question was how it performed against the enemy it actually met. And the answer is that against that enemy, on that day, the fight was not close. Which is exactly why the next set of numbers matters so much. Desert Storm produced the worst friendly fire record of any modern American war. And it is not close. Friendly fire caused 17% of the 615 United States service members killed or wounded in the conflict. 35 of 148 American combat deaths were caused by Americans. Strip out the rear area casualties from Iraqi missile strikes, and the battlefield rate rises to roughly 23%. 17 misidentified ground engagements destroyed 27 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, which is 77% of every armored vehicle the United States Army lost in the entire war. In one action connected to the fighting at 73 Easting, documented in the Defense Department's own investigation, 5 Bradleys and 5 Abrams were hit. 9 of those 10 were hit by 120mm depleted uranium sabot rounds fired from American Abrams. Visibility, the investigators noted, was degraded by dusk, blowing sand and smoke. And here's the detail that turns a statistic into something you can feel. Investigators were able to identify who fired those rounds because depleted uranium leaves a distinctive radioactive signature in the hole it makes. The same ammunition that made the Abrams unbeatable that afternoon also left a forensic fingerprint on the vehicles it hit by mistake. The thermal sight that let American crews see through the storm did not tell them what they were looking at. It gave them a hot shape at 2,000 meters in conditions where nobody could confirm anything visually, and it gave it to them while their own doctrine told them to shoot first at that range. That is the mechanism. Superior sensors without matching identification created a lethal gap, and Americans died in it. The response, driven hard afterward, was thermal identification panels, combat identification programs, and eventually the friend or foe systems now standard on armored vehicles. Government Accountability Office investigators later found serious flaws in how some of these incidents were investigated, including one case in which awards for valor were granted on the basis of misrepresentations by military officers. There is one more correction to make before the verdict, and it comes from the academic side. In 1996, Stephen Biddle published an analysis in International Security, arguing that the lopsided outcome of the Gulf War could not be explained by technology alone. His model held that the decisive variable was the interaction between American technical superiority and a very large gap in skill, crew training, gunnery discipline, junior leader initiative, the ability to maneuver off-road at night by satellite navigation, and arrive as a coherent formation. As Darrell Press summarized the model, if the Iraqis had been trained to Western standards, American losses at 73 Easting would have run to something like 70%, while Iraqi losses would have been closer to 30%. That is a model, not a measurement, and it should be treated as one, but it points at something the equipment story misses. Reread the 23 minutes. Driver deciding to keep rolling through live mines to protect his frontal arc. A loader kicking a jammed round into a chamber with his boot. A private hand-loading missiles on the outside of a moving vehicle under fire. A captain choosing to break his limit of advance and eat the consequences later. None of that came out of a factory. So, where does the Abrams actually rank after 73 Easting? 3 things decided that afternoon, and they matter in ascending order. The third was the machine. The thermal sight, the rangefinder, the stabilized gun, and the depleted uranium dart worked exactly as advertised, in the worst possible conditions, at a range where the enemy's return fire could not reach. The core marketing claim of the M1A1, that it could fight and win in conditions where the other side was effectively blind, was tested against a real enemy in a real defensive position, and it held. That is rarer than it sounds. Most wonder weapons come back from their first war with an asterisk. The second was the crews. The equipment gap explains why the Iraqis could not shoot back effectively. It does not explain why 9 tanks advancing into a prepared position with minefields and a reserve took 0 losses. That was training, drilled to the point of reflex. Plus a run of individual decisions made in seconds by sergeants and specialists whose names are in the records precisely because those decisions were not automatic. And the one that has to be said plainly was the enemy and the day. Export tanks with obsolete ammunition and worn barrels, no thermal capability, a commander who had planned for a road-bound opponent in an army that had just been handed satellite navigation, and a sandstorm that took away the one advantage a dug-in defender normally keeps, which is seeing the attacker first. Change any one of those and the 23 minutes reads differently. The verdict is this. 73 Easting was one of the most decisive armored engagements in modern military history. The Abrams' defining combat record is real, and the technical claim underneath it is honest. But it was proven against a specific enemy under specific conditions. And the more carefully you read the sources, the softer the headline numbers get. Combat proven, yes. Invincible, no. Nothing is. The tank in that story is still in service, still being rebuilt into newer configurations, still the heaviest thing in most armored formations on Earth, and it has been to a very different war. The United States announced 31 M1A1 Abrams for Ukraine in January of 2023. They arrived that autumn and went into combat with the 47th Mechanized Brigade in February of 2024. The first one was destroyed on or before the 26th of February 2024, near Berdichi in the Avdiivka sector. That is 33 years to the day after 73 Easting, which is a coincidence and nothing more. But it is a hard one to ignore. How it died is itself contested, and the disagreement is instructive. The Warzone and David Axe, writing for Forbes, reported a first-person view drone striking the tank's ammunition compartment and starting a fire that consumed it. Army recognition attributed the action to a Russian motorized rifle brigade using a loitering munition followed by an anti-tank missile. Either way, the weapon that killed it cost a rounding error against the price of the tank. By late April of 2024, Ukraine had pulled its surviving Abrams back from the front line. The vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff explained the reasoning publicly in terms nobody in 1991 would have understood. In an environment saturated with unmanned aircraft, massing armor is itself the risk. That September, Axe estimated the brigade had at most 25 of the 31 tanks left. By mid-2025, Russian state media were claiming 26 of the 31 destroyed, a figure that comes from an interested party and should be treated as a claim rather than a count until independent visual confirmation catches up with it. The armor did not get worse. The composite package on a modern Abrams is better than what Eagle Troop drove. What changed is the direction the threat comes from and what it costs. In 1991, the exchange was a multi-million-dollar tank against a multi-million-dollar tank, decided by who could see further. In 2024, it is a multi-million-dollar tank against something a soldier assembles from commercial parts and flies into the roof, where the armor is thinnest, for the price of a used motorcycle. The Abrams was designed to win the duel it was in. It was not designed to make that trade. Which brings us back to 1,420 meters. That number was the whole American advantage in 1991, the distance at which one crew could see and shoot, and the other could do neither. It was the measure of everything the Abrams was built to do. 33 years later, in a field near Berdichi, that distance meant nothing at all because the thing that killed the tank never had to close it, never had to be seen, and never had a crew inside it. 23 minutes made the Abrams a legend. A few $100s of hobby electronics is what made it argue for its life. So tell me where you rank it. Is 73 Easting the finest armored debut of the modern era? Or is it a battle we remember mostly because the other side could not see? And what would you take into Ukraine tomorrow if the choice were yours? Subscribe. The next system is already in the queue.